No homicide investigator wants to have a case unsolved. But there are times where it takes a while to get the answers. The 1983 stabbing case of Michelle Buckingham went unsolved for decades. So I knew when I met her mother, who'd been struggling for over 30 years, that I had to do my best. In any homicide investigation, failure is not an option. The body of a man on the front seat which was badly burned. We don't know whether he's been shot, we don't know whether he's been stabbed. It's a horrific act, and any death is tragic. A total of 9 shots were fired.
The best detectives Victoria's ever seen.
I don't intend to stop until someone's brought to justice. Failure is not an option. Would have been 2012. I was in charge and working at the cold case section within the homicide squad. I got a phone call from Tammy Mills. She was working at the Shepparton newspaper. Tammy says, look, I'm concerned that no one seems to want to do anything about the death of this 16-year-old girl in 1983, and I think we should reinvestigate it. I said to Tammy, look, I'll be honest with you, I don't have sufficient staff at the moment to do anything about it. She said, well, I've been around to see the mother, Elvira Buckingham. I've now written an article about Michelle Buckingham's death, and I want to publish it. I said, look, don't publish it yet, but what I'll do is I'll promise to come up and see you. So I went through the file. Michelle was 16. Was vibrant. Her whole life ahead of her. She dies an horrific death. She's left on the side of the road. She's found 3 weeks later.
Michelle Buckingham disappeared on October 21st after leaving the Victoria Hotel in Shepparton. Her badly decomposed body was found in scrub at Kyalla East on November 7th. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to the back.
So 30 years on, this case had gone unsolved. This was one of the oldest cold cases in Victoria. It was going to be a challenge.
The Shepparton News was my first job out of university, so I was a cadet journalist. I had compiled a list of 6 unsolved crimes in Shepparton, and Michelle's just stuck with me because she was 16 years old. She was left on the side of the road like an animal, and it also felt like most of the town had forgotten about her. There'd been no publicity since the late 80s, and that to me just felt deeply wrong. This person's killer's still out there.
So the following week, I drove to Shepparton on my own to see Tammy Mills.
When Ron came into the news offices, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed because he's this big city detective that is in the papers, and so he was a formidable presence. But this case, it just wouldn't let me go. So I was determined that Ron would agree to help me.
I said, Tammy, you're breaking my balls, right? I said, I don't have the staff, but she was passionate, and I had a view that whenever you do media or an article in the newspaper, it always jogs someone's memory. So I said, I'll tell you what, you write the story, let's see what information comes in. I went back to Melbourne and I got the file out to look at what had happened in 1983 in relation to Michelle's disappearance. About a week before she disappeared, Michelle and her mum, Elvira, had an argument. Michelle decided that I want to be independent. I'm going to move out, and she rented a caravan at Stray Leaves Caravan Park. She wasn't into drugs, she wasn't promiscuous. She was just somebody who decided school wasn't for me. And back then, we're going back to 1982, 83, some people left school early, she got a job, she was supporting herself, and she was strong-willed and wanted to be independent. Michelle was reported missing by her father. I think he'd gone to a caravan the day after, that she'd actually disappeared on the Friday night, and she wasn't there. Elvira and her husband had separated, so I think initially it was some concern, well, the family unit's broken down, has she run away of her own accord? And it wasn't until the first week of November, when the body was found, that it turned into a murder investigation. In 1983, this was the location where Michelle Buckingham was found. Her body was found by a farmer who was driving along the road. He saw what he thought was something black buried in the grass about a metre high. Got out and discovered the body. It looks remote, but it's only 12 or so kilometres from Shepparton. But I look at it and think that's a very lonely, lonely place to ultimately pass away. So I went through the file. Lo and behold, someone actually got charged. Gregory Gledhill was charged with the murder of Michelle Buckingham.
In a statement read to the court yesterday, Gregory Peter Gledhill, 26, of Shepparton, said he had been forced to watch Michelle's murder after a drinking session at this local hotel.
About 4 months after the murder, Gregory Gledhill came into my office. I didn't know exactly what he was there for, but I assumed it was a criminal matter because that's what I did. He threw a knife on the desk and told me that was the knife that killed Michelle Buckingham, which tended to focus my mind. I decided to immediately get a tape recorder. He told me that he was a witness to the murder, that he was a passenger in a vehicle where a number of men had stabbed her to death. He sounded credible.
Gregory Gledhill makes this very distinguishable noise about what it's like to stab someone.
I can remember him telling me he could hear the, quote, woof, woof of the knife going into her body. I wasn't going to go near that knife. It was too hot for me to handle. I thought, look, I'll get his statement, I'll go to the police. I wasn't about to sort of turn myself into an investigator.
Eventually, Gledhill was brought into the Shepparton police station and they took a detailed statement. And what he said was, Michelle left the Victoria Hotel about 8:30 at night. He says, I was forced into the car and we were taken back to a house in East Shepparton where she was raped and ultimately she was killed. Now, one of those men owned the house where Gledhill says, we took her and we put her in a bedroom. That room was forensically examined. Even if they've cleaned the room up and washed the walls down, you would expect to find blood splatter by using a chemical called luminol. You would see it glow in the dark. Forensically, at that house, nothing was found. The three of them all make statements to say, no, that didn't happen. No, that's a lie. Gregory Gledhill's telling lies.
Some time later, my client was charged with the murder. But at no stage did he say anything that led me to believe that he was anything other than a witness. I mean, it's one of the shortest committal proceedings I've ever seen. I mean, you can't do much with no evidence.
After a 3-day hearing here at Tatura Court, Magistrate John Tobin found there was insufficient evidence to send Gledhill to trial and dismissed the murder charge.
I feel greatly relieved, but we'll never repair the damage that's been done.
But for Michelle's mother, the decision brought little comfort. Mrs Buckingham says she'll now have to live with the thought her daughter's killer may never be found.
I think it's too long, and whoever's done it's been very clever.
The rumours about why Greg came forward to tell that story was he was trying to get in with one of the local bikie clubs at the time. Whether that's true, I have no idea. He may have been mentally unwell, he may have been stood over. Take your pick.
So now I have read the file and I've read all the material around Gregory Gledhill. I formed the view that Gregory Gledhill couldn't have been involved. There were a couple of significant things. Gledhill says, I was at the Victoria Hotel when she was abducted, and it's about 8:30 at night. But there are two ladies who are driving down the highway towards Stray Leaves Caravan Park. They stop and speak to Michelle Buckingham. They say, would you like a lift? She says, no, I'm all right. Where are you going? I'm going to Stray Leaves Caravan Park. Am I walking in the right direction? Yes, you are. Now that's around 8:30, 8:35. How is it that she could be abducted at 8:30 when she's walking down the road, kilometres away? Then we went back through the file again. Well, lo and behold, there's a witness in the file who sees a green Holden V8 parked on the side of the road at the location where the body is a couple of days later. Now, this is after she's disappeared, but before the body's found. So the theory was the killer has gone back out there to check if the body's still there. Gledhill didn't have a green Holden V8. Cold case is not about being critical of the first process. It's about having a new set of eyes and looking at it. I've investigated several cold cases and I thought, you know what? I don't think that I've ever investigated a homicide where the person responsible has not told someone. So in unsolved homicide, it's about finding that person who actually knows. An ounce of information is worth a ton of investigation.
So I got this phone call from Ron and he said, okay, we can do this. We're going to reinvestigate it. And the words that he used was, this case is solvable. I was blown away.
Somebody in the community will always have the answer. You've just got to find them. In 2012, I was reinvestigating the cold case murder of 16-year-old Michelle Buckingham near Shepparton. Back in 1983, she'd been stabbed multiple times. And decades later, a local journalist, Tammy Mills, decided somebody in the community must know something. So it was probably 3 or 4 weeks later, there's a massive story in the Shepparton News. Cold case reopened, Michelle Buckingham's murder will be reinvestigated.
So the aim of the story was to get people to come forward, and every day for the week we would put into the story this call for information. So it was like someone somewhere knows something about what happened to Michelle.
So the information starts to come in. Most of it relates to Gregory Gledhill. Because for 20 years, people within Shepparton still believed that Gregory Gledhill was the killer.
I had heard that Gledhill had been assaulted numerous times by members of the public who had decided, well, he must have done it. And I believe he suffered very badly. He was hospitalised as a result of some of those assaults, and he lived a terrible life.
So I went and saw Gledhill. He's living with his father. His father was 86. I said, Greg, I've reviewed the file. I'm satisfied that you've got nothing to do whatsoever with Michelle's death. He goes, thank God for that. He said, I used to work. I have not worked for 30 years. The fact that I got charged totally destroyed me. There are times when people, for whatever reason, want some notoriety and inject themselves into an investigation. Sometimes, if it's a high-profile case, they want to feel part of it. I never asked Greg why he did it, why he volunteered false leads, but I was satisfied just from reading the file that it wasn't him.
When Ron exonerated Gregory Gledhill, that was massive news. There was such a buzz in the town. I could overhear people talking about the story at cafes or just, walking around town. I'd see people with a copy of the paper. And at the same time, we were posting a lot of the stories on the news Facebook page, and we were getting a lot of Michelle's friends from high school sharing memories of Michelle, what she was like, what they did together. And that was like almost breathing life back into Michelle.
I was working on Michelle's case in Shepparton. A young police officer called me. He said there'd been some information passed through to Crime Stoppers and that a man had rung the police station looking for me. The information was that I should contact someone called Norm, because he knows who killed Michelle Buckingham. So I made a phone call to that person, Norm. He said, I want to meet you at the Shepparton East Football Oval tonight. On reflection, I think, what was I doing? What am I doing? Going down to meet a bloke I don't know? What if I got abducted? I think I was caught up in the moment, hoping I might ultimately solve one of the oldest cold cases in Victoria. It was around 7 o'clock at night and a white ute comes in and I can see the glow of a cigarette through the driver's door. A man gets out and he comes across to me. I was reasonably nervous and he said, "Ron." And I said, "Are you Norm?" He says, "Yes." I said, "Norm, I'll have a smoke with you." Now, I didn't smoke, but I always smoke with crooks or in situations like that. So this is about having something in common. Norm says to me, "I want to tell you what happened."
He just needed to know how I knew, and yeah, I told him the whole story.
Norm says, on a Saturday morning in October 1983, my brother-in-law, Stephen Bradley, came to me. I'm married to Stephen's sister, Kerry.
So I walked across, say hello, Steve. Here he's got blood all over his hands. I said, what the hell is going on? He was shivering and he was mumbling and blubbering, and I said, oh my God. He said, I've killed someone. I said, excuse me? He said, yeah, he said, I've killed someone, Norm. I said, bullshit, Steve. I said, you can't do that.
Norm says, you're going to have to go to the police. Steve says, oh no, I'm not going to the police. Norm says, well, I'll tell you what we'll do. Get in my car and we're going for a drive and we'll sort this out.
And I picked up 4 cans of beer. I took off to Waranga Basin. It's where we used to go and have barbecues and that.
Norm says, Steve, have a beer. Tell me what happened. Steve says, I was driving down the road. I was near Stray Leaves Caravan Park. I saw Michelle. I invited her to get in the car, which she did. I then drove further to Shepparton East to an old hotel. It's called the Pine Lodge. We parked around the back of the Pine Lodge in a car park. Steve says, for whatever reason, I put the hard word on Michelle.
What do you mean you put it on her? He said, I asked her for sex. I said, really, Steve? He said, yeah. He said, no, she refused and started to get into a bit of a scuffle. He said, and I don't know, he said, I just stabbed her. I said, bullshit. I can't believe it, Stephen. Did you take her to hospital or anything? He said, no, she was dead. She was dead.
Steve says, I panic. I'm driving in the dark. It's like driving in a tunnel. And I get to a particular point out at Kyella and I get her out of the car and I leave her on the side of the road. Norm says, are you telling me the truth? You're not bullshitting me, are you, Steve? Steve says, no.
I said, for God's sake, Steve, you're going to have to go to the police, mate. He said, no, I can't do it. Leave it to me. He said, I'll figure it out. The next thing I knew, He was gone to Cobo, up top of New South Wales. So I told Ron what I knew. I think I could have blew him over with a feather. I don't think he had any doubts that I knew from the way he spoke to me. And he didn't even take any notes at that time.
I say, Norm, why didn't you come forward? He said, well, how could I? I'm living with Steve's sister. I would have put my own wife's brother in for a murder. But he said, I carried the secret for 30 years. And it wasn't until I looked at the front page of the paper. I'm doing my part-time job. I'm rolling up newspapers into plastic. And he said, I can't believe what I see. Who killed Michelle Buckingham? He said, I looked at it and I think, I can't keep this secret any longer.
So I told Stephen's eldest brother, and then he opened the can of worms. And then Ron contacted me.
So as I stand there and I'm talking to Norm, the penny drops. I say to him, are you sure of the day that he told you? He says, absolutely. It was a Saturday. It was before the body was found. From that point on, I had the identity of who I believe was Michelle's killer. But is that sufficient to charge him? No. How are you going to do it? You've got 30 years to catch up. The first question is, where was Stephen Bradley? It would have been late 2012. I met a man named Norm who came forward with information. He says, I've kept a secret for 30 years. My brother-in-law, Stephen Bradley, told me he killed Michelle Buckingham. In October 1983, Michelle was living at the Stray Leaves Caravan Park. Stephen was also living at the caravan park in a different caravan. He was about 21 years of age. He was a shearer, so he travelled around rural Victoria, up into New South Wales.
Stephen was very reserved. He was very quiet. He was only a small person, and you'd think, you know, he'd run from a fight than get involved. It amazed me that this happened. He would be one of the last people I would think could do something like this.
So I thought, OK, I've got the information now. So myself, Alan Birch, who is the detective sergeant, now it's for us to actually turn that information into evidence.
I must say I was a bit dubious at the start because I didn't know what Norm may have repeated because he heard it in the inquest or saw it in print. But the fact that an over 30-year-old murder might well be solved, that of itself says to you that there is reason not to give up ever.
So I believed I had the information which would solve Michelle's death. Now, whilst you've got this pressure that you're going to solve this job, I thought, no, I need to go and see Michelle's mother, Elvira. She's aware that there's a reinvestigation, and I haven't met her before. And I drive around to Elvira's house. And I can remember walking down the driveway, and my heart is going thump, thump, thump. And I knock at the door. She comes out, she said, who are you? And I'm in a casual shirt and a pair of jeans. I say, I'm Ron Iddles from the Homicide Squad. So she says, come in. And I said, I can solve your daughter's death. She said, oh, I've heard that before, Ron. I said to her, someone's come forward. He says, I know who killed Michelle. And she said, Ron, for 30 years I've tried to get over it. But you've just walked into my house and you're telling me that you're going to solve this. If you don't solve it, you're going to take me on a roller coaster ride. You'll take me to the top of the mountain and I'll crash. She said, how do I know that I can trust you? I said, you can trust me. She got up. She gave me a big hug. And she said, I'll trust you. And I said, I'll do the best that I can.
Michelle Buckingham's mother, Elvira, touched him more emotionally, I think, because she was becoming elderly and it was still hard for her. You know, Elvira was robbed of a lot of memories that she should have had and a future with Michelle. So for Ron, it was a moment in his career that identified really how the job actually was his life and how he really did want to help people. And she was one of those people that he really wanted to help.
I made a personal commitment to Elvira. And I went a dangerous path, I think, because I think if you become emotionally involved, you put an enormous amount of pressure on yourself and your judgment can be clouded. One of my sayings is, failure is not an option. Follow every possible lead. But we're 30 years on. The trail's cold. Where am I going to get the evidence? Is there any forensic evidence? Where's Stephen Bradley? You know, how am I going to get sufficient to charge him? Are there witnesses? You know what? Norm told me Stephen Bradley, at the time that Michelle went missing, had a green HQ Holden V8. Now, when you go back into the file, I have a witness who sees a green car at the location where the body is a couple of days later. The inference from that is Stephen Bradley's gone back out there to see if the body's still there. So I have a little bit of evidence. So we profile and we work out where Stephen Bradley is, and he's living in a boarding house alone in Queensland.
So Stephen Bradley was a chronic alcoholic. He lived alone in a flat in Brisbane, and he'd worked for quite a number of years in a veterinary surgery. He essentially kept the surgery clean and animals fed and the like. But he would essentially go home, drink, go to work, work, go home, drink, go to work, work. That was his life.
I've got the evidence of Norm, very, very strong. I've got the evidence of a man who says, I see a green car. We get to the point where we actually need to interview him. We fly to Brisbane, and the plan is that we will arrest him at the bus stop at around 4:15 when he leaves his work. A short time later, Stephen comes around and I say, my name's Ron Iddles. I'm a Detective Senior Sergeant from the Homicide Squad in Melbourne. I want to interview you about the circumstances and the death of Michelle Buckingham.
So Bradley, at the time of his arrest, was completely compliant. In fact, it was almost like he expected it. It was whole and total acceptance of what was going to occur.
So I sit Stephen down in the interview room. I don't have a desk. Let's just have a conversation. But I'm going to ask him some questions and you have to plan for that interview. How am I going to approach him? Well, it's about breaking bread. Steve, do you want a coffee? No, Ron, I don't want a coffee. And I say, I got to tell you, Steve, I can't go on unless I have a coffee. All right, I'll have one with you. Already I've built a relationship. So I say, tell me about 1983. Where were you living in Shepparton? Oh, I was living at the Stray Leaves Caravan Park. I asked, what sort of cars did you have back then? Steve says, I had a green Premier, a Holden V8. Do you have relatives in Shepparton? Oh, yes, I do, Ron. One's my brother-in-law, Norm. And I say, well, tell me a bit about Norm. He says, oh, he's a great bloke. Now, why did I ask that question? Because later on, when I'm going to put to him things that Norm have said, he might say, well, he's a drug addict. He's a bullshit artist. I wouldn't believe one thing. So I've already had him confirm Norm is a great bloke.
Ron's interview of Bradley in Queensland was brilliant. They had a facility where you could monitor it outside the interview room, and I can say, with all honesty, that every detective who was at the Queensland Homicide Squad at that time was in that small room watching that monitor. Ron had completely and utterly engaged with Bradley, and all that Ron was obviously doing was seeking the truth.
Then I say to him, what do you know about Michelle Buckingham? He says, I don't know anything. I don't even know her name. I said, Steve, you'd be the only bloke in Shepparton that's never heard her name. No, Ron. I say to him, well, someone has come to me and said Steve is responsible for the stabbing death of Michelle Buckingham. What can you tell me about that? Ron, I can't tell you anything. I ask him, have you ever told anyone that you stabbed Michelle Buckingham? No. No, Ron, no, I haven't. Well, Steve, I want to share with you something. The person who told me that you killed Michelle Buckingham was your brother-in-law, Norm. And he says, I'm not sure whether I've done it. Steve, what are you telling me? Are you telling me that you could have killed her and you don't remember? Oh, Ron, I'm not sure whether I did. So I've arrested Stephen Bradley for a murder that's 30 years old. 16-year-old Michelle Buckingham. So I say, Steve, let's look at what you told your brother-in-law, Norm. You told him that you'd stabbed her. He sits there. Oh, Ron, I'm not sure. So this goes on for about an hour, and I think, this is very odd. How am I actually going to prove it? When the person sits opposite you, they are innocent until proven guilty, regardless of their background, regardless of their criminal history, regardless of their race. This is about searching for the truth. So I actually asked halfway through, Steve, did you kill her? He says, Ron, I'm not the sort of person that does that. Well, that just tells me that's not a strong answer. You're talking future tense, not past. What I'm looking for there is, I didn't do it. Eventually, he says, you know, Ron, When I told you I couldn't remember, see, that's not quite right. He says, for 25 years I've been having a dream. He says, I have it about 5 times a week. I'm in bed, sound asleep, and then I get this young girl who comes and sits on my chest. I say to him, describe the girl to me. He predominantly describes Michelle Buckingham. And he says, I have this memory of a knife and I'm holding a knife. Then in the dream, I have a vision of driving down a black hole. I'm driving fast. I have a vision of dumping a body somewhere.
So Bradley didn't confess, which is admitting to all the material facts of the case. He made admissions to his involvement. He would give explanation as, I thought that was a dream. I had a dream about doing this. I had a dream about doing that. Just so happens that the elements of those dreams match the physical evidence of what happened to Michelle Buckingham.
And I remember ringing Elvira, Michelle's mum, and I said to Elvira, we've arrested Stephen Bradley. He will be charged and he'll be extradited back to Melbourne. She went silent for a minute and then she said, thank you. And she said, Ron, I don't know how I feel. And I got the sense that 30 years on, she was probably struggling to comprehend that it had actually happened. But she was looking forward to seeing the end result.
For more than 30 years, Stephen Bradley has looked over his shoulder, hoping this moment would never arrive. The 52-year-old will spend tonight in custody in the Brisbane City Watch House and is expected to front Melbourne Magistrates Court tomorrow afternoon to formally answer one charge of murder.
And I remember the day we arrested him. He says to me on the way to the airport in the car, I should have told someone a long time ago and I would have been out. I said, you know what, Steve? That's probably true. I felt a little bit sorry for him. But at the end of the day, he took someone else's life. What about Michelle? She was 16. It was my last case, and it was the last case ever to be heard in the Shepparton Supreme Court in the old building. One week before the trial, Elvira rang me and she said, I'm worried about the trial. I said, what are you worried about? She said, I think they'll trash the reputation of my daughter. I said, no, they won't. There's nothing in your daughter's history for them to attack. She said, oh, I'm feeling the pressure of the trial, Ron. 3 days later, she had a massive heart attack. And she died. She never, ever got to see the end result.
I will never forget sitting there in that courthouse waiting for the verdict to come down. When they returned that verdict of guilty, I was just in shock. I couldn't believe that justice had been done.
We are extremely happy with the outcome of today's sentencing, and we are glad the justice system has not let us down.
And we'll be going to the cemetery this afternoon. Thank you.
I want to thank the 12 people who deliberated on the jury. Sadly, the mum can't be there for it. She waited for 32 years for this, and she died of a heart attack about a week ago.
I feel very lucky to have been entrusted so much with Ron, and he inspires me to be ethical, to be determined and to be passionate. He's actually got a nickname amongst some police detectives, which is TGM, the Great Man. So, I mean, what other person would you want handling a case than the Great Man?